So Joshua and the people of Israel, that first generation, they go into the promised land, right? Moses isn't allowed to go into that promised land. Joshua and the people of Israel, that first generation, they enter into the promised land of Canaan. And they were called then to fight against the Canaanites that lived there. Now, we tend to think, when we hear the word Canaanite, we tend to think like, oh, this is one massive people group. It's really not. This is an area of land that we would consider to be Canaan, but there's all these different types of people groups that are living in this area that we would consider to be Canaan. Now, what transpires, what we see in Joshua, and then it's kind of recounted there in Judges, is that things start off pretty well. Judah begins the combat, and he does pretty well, and most of the territory that he should have taken, or that tribe should have taken, they take. There's a couple of them there that they don't, but most of it they do. But as we read through that storyline about different tribes and what they're able to take, we finally get to, as recounted in Judges, the tribe of Dan. Dan didn't get to take very much. In fact, some of the stuff that they were able to take by force, by war that God had commanded, they actually lost. They actually got driven back, and they lost land. So it starts off pretty decently, but by the time you get to the end, things don't go so well. And basically what happens is that Israel, rather than having all of the promised land at that moment, only have a portion of it. They really just become one of many different groups, people groups, in the land of Canaan. And that's really the way it was through Saul's reign. That's why God had commanded Saul to go to battle against the Amorites and then to the Amalekites and to the Philistines and such, because they were still there in the land. They weren't supposed to be in the first place, but they were there still. And so then Saul is called on to then help Israel and defeat these people. But ultimately, Israel, for hundreds of years, were not able to defeat their enemies in any complete way. But then here we have David. Enter David into the scene, right? God's anointed one, a man after God's own heart. Right? It is David who has killed his tens of thousands. Saul, just his thousands. David, his tens of thousands. And God would use David then to bring Israel out of that idea of being just one of many into being the main group. He still wouldn't be able to conquer all. Ultimately, it was Solomon, his own son, that was able to extend the borders of Israel and conquer the enemies in completion, but David was really who got the ball rolling in the positive. And here's the thing is, he did it without Israel probably even realizing what he was doing. God was using David in such a way that Israel was oblivious to it. That's what we see today. God is working on behalf of his people even when they are oblivious to his doings. And he does this all the time, right? This is not just specific with David. He does this all the time. He just does it in different ways. This morning, as we go through this, through these two chapters, what we are seeing are 4 different examples and seeing how God is on the move for his people Israel. And ultimately, we also see that he is doing kind of the same things, maybe in different ways, for us. I love what John Piper says. He famously said, God is always doing 10,000 things in your life. And you may be aware of 3 of those things. But he is constantly at work. In this case, we're seeing 4 of those things. 4 examples here. The writer of 1 Samuel first shows us that God is working by showing David's foresight established. Then we see God at work by the writer showing us foolishness expressed. And we progress further into God's work by seeing faithfulness extolled. And then finally we see God at work when the writer of 1 Samuel shows us God's favorableness extended. Those are in the 2 chapters that we are going to be reading here this morning. So it's foresight established, foolishness expressed, faithfulness extolled, and favorableness extended. So if you will please stand for the honor of the reading of God's word. We're going to read the first 12 verses of 1 Samuel chapter 26, but we're going to be going through 1 Samuel 26 and 27. Then the Ziphites came to Saul at Gibeah, saying, "Is not David hiding himself on the hill of Hachilah, which is on the east of Jeshimon?" So Saul arose and went down to the wilderness of Ziph with 3,000 chosen men, of Israel to seek David in the wilderness of Ziph. And Saul encamped on the hill of Hachilah, which is beside the road on the east of Jeshimon. But David remained in the wilderness. When he saw that Saul had came after him into the wilderness, David sent out spies and learned that Saul had indeed come. Then David rose and came to the place where Saul had encamped, and David saw the place where Saul lay, and Abner, the son of Ner, the commander of his army. And Saul was lying within the encampment while the army was encamped around him. Then David said to Ahimelech the Hittite and to Joab's brother Abishai and the son of Zeruiah, "Who will go down with me into the camp of Saul?" And Abishai said, "I will go down with you." So David and Abishai went to the army by night, and there lay Saul sleeping within the encampment with his spear stuck in the ground at his head, and Abner and Abner and the army lay around him. Then Abishai said to David, "God has given your enemy into your hand this day. Now please let me pin him to the earth with one stroke of the spear, and I will not strike him twice." But David said to Abishai, "Do not destroy him, for who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless?" And David said, "As the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him, or his day will come to die, or he will go down into battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I should put my hand out against the Lord's anointed. But take now the spear that is at his head and the jar of water, and let's go." So David took the spear and the jar of water from Saul's head, and they went away. No man saw it or knew it, nor did they awake, for they were all asleep, because a deep sleep from the Lord had fallen upon them. Hey, you may be seated. So at the very beginning of this text, we find that the Ziphites are once again coming to Saul and spilling the beans on David. They've already done this once, right? Apparently they didn't like David. Maybe they were scared of Saul, but they're coming against David and going down to Saul and telling Saul, "Hey, David's back in our place." If you remember, David would go from place to place to place to place. He was doing a very maneuvering kind of thing that he was doing so that Saul would never be able to find him, except the Ziphites give it away. They go and tell Saul, "Here is David. He's up near us. Come and get it. Come and get him." And so Saul goes with 3,000 of his best goons, his best men, to find him. And it's here, then, that we see David's foresight once again being established. Now, when I say foresight, I don't necessarily mean at all that David was like a prophet and that he saw into the future. I'm more using it like in the vernacular, that he had foresight. He had the understanding. He had the mental capacity. He realized he was being prudent here, right? He was able to go, wait a second, if I go after him too fast, if I don't do my due diligence here, this could be really bad. So instead, what he does is he actually sends off some spies. So let's go back to verses 3 through 5. And Saul encamped on the hill of Hachilah, which is beside the road on the east of Jeshimon. But David remained in the wilderness. So he keeps hiding, right? And when he saw that Saul came after him into the wilderness, David sent out spies and learned that Saul had indeed come. Then David rose and came to the place where Saul had encamped. And David saw the place where Saul lay, with Abner and the son of Ner, the commander of his army. Saul was lying within the encampment, while the army was encamped around him. So David understood his plight. He understood what was going on. He knew that he was the man that Saul was after. There were people that were under his charge that he needed to take care of. 600 men had followed after David. One false move, they could all be dead. And so David goes and he sends out those spies to see exactly, because at the very least he needs to know, is Saul really there with the army? And is Saul, and where exactly is Saul going to be? He needed at the very least to figure that out. And so he sends out his spies, they tell him exactly where Saul is. Then he secretly, quietly goes and sees for himself. He does some personal reconnaissance, right? And it's always good to listen to those that you trust, right? He sends out the spies, they come back, they tell him, it's good to listen to those whom you trust, but at some point in time, there comes the time you have to learn certain things for yourself. Right? So like the Bereans, right? Like the Bereans, they hear Paul speaking. He's speaking the gospel message to them, and so they hear it. Like, it sounds right. Let's go back to the scriptures. Let's find out and make sure for ourselves. So here's David. He hears from the spies this is where Saul is. He goes out there on his own, or at least with 2 other people, does some personal reconnaissance here. And clearly Saul had come, and he had come with his best men. But even then, once David knew, and remember, he's already had this promise from the very beginning. The point that he was anointed as king, he has the promise of God that he's going to be king. He has Jonathan come and reiterate it a couple of times to him. He has Abigail reiterate. He has the promise of God, and yet with this promise of God, he still doesn't go in guns a-blazing. He does not put the Lord to the test. Sometimes we're not so wise. Sometimes we bite off more than we can chew. Anybody ever bite off more than I've done it? Right? And it can be about anything. It doesn't necessarily have to be like, going into an encampment that's filled with an enemy. It can be just about anything, right? We involve ourselves in matters without giving much forethought, without giving much foresight. For example, for me, a few years ago, we were doing our basement. We were kind of trying to finish our basement for the kids, and we were putting a bathroom down there, and I was able to do a lot of the work. I was able to do the construction. I was able to run the wires and do the electricity. And the one thing that I could not do, which is pertinent to a bathroom, is the plumbing, right? I couldn't do the plumbing in the bathroom, though I tried. And I tried. And I tried. And every stinking time there was a leak somewhere. And I couldn't do it. I can't tell you how many days I spent trying to do plumbing in that bathroom before finally giving up and calling a plumber who had it done within like 2 hours, right? Not one more leak. I bit off a little bit more than I can chew. I know that's kind of like trivial kind of thing, but it's still, there's sometimes that we just don't give the foresight, we don't give the forethought that we need to give it. Sometimes we do. We enter into a fray, into this encampment maybe of the enemy. We involve ourselves in a matter that we should not involve ourselves in. I do this all the time. Still, I'm not going to give another example, right? But where there's an argument going on, and I think I understand what's going on, and I am going to put my 2 cents in, only to find out, once again, I was foolish. I should have had a little bit more foresight, forethought in that. One of my favorite proverbs that I wish I would follow more often comes from Proverbs 26:17. It says, "Whoever meddles in a quarrel not his own is like one who takes a passing dog by the ears." It's a great proverb. Sometimes we need to give a little bit more forethought. How much better would life be if we simply just stood back and gave some foresight, some forethought to what we are about to enter? If you're not a believer, maybe you're a skeptic, maybe you're just unsure, maybe you're just curious, right? Jesus tells you, do not enter into this relationship lightly, to give it some forethought, to give it some foresight. Go with me real quick, if you will, to Luke chapter 14. The Christian life is not necessarily for everybody because it'll be difficult. We see in Luke chapter 14, starting at verse 28, he says, "For which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, 'This man began to build and was not able to finish.' Or what king, going out to encounter another king in war, will not sit down first and deliberate whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who has come against him with 20,000? And if not, while the other is yet a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. So therefore, any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple." In other words, give it some forethought. Don't rush in. Be careful. Beloved, we at Highland View Baptist Church, if we desire to make a difference in this community, with those people that are around us, with the houses and the families, the singles, the hurting. We want to make a difference. We want to do something in this community. We're not going to be able to do it without foresight. We have to realistically look at ourselves. We have to realistically look at our community. We need to know the culture, the people. We need to know the needs. Haphazard ministry is about as good as a haphazard battle plan. It does nobody any good, and it can hurt a lot of people. David has some forethought. He has some foresight here. We not only see that, though. God not only is working in establishing his foresight, but we also see him showing it with foolishness being expressed. And there's a lot of foolishness going on in these two chapters. Like, a lot. Like, everybody is being foolish except for David. We got to see David's foolishness last week, right? Abigail comes against David and says, hey, don't do this, right? David finally remembers and his character is restored. And now all of a sudden we're looking and we see pretty much everybody in this storyline is being foolish in some way. And David is having to correct them. Because we read ahead, you see that. So let's look real quick. Because we start with Abishai. David and Ahimelech, the Hittite, not the former priest who was killed. That would be weird, right? But Ahimelech, the Hittite, and then Abishai, David's nephew, they go down to spy out where Saul is. David says, hey, who wants to go with me? Abishai says, I'll go. And so they go in. The army is asleep. And when you look at verse 8, then Abishai said to David, God has given your enemy into your hand this day. They're whispering because they're asleep, right? Now please let me pin him to the earth with one stroke of the spear, and I will not strike him twice. You remember maybe that David was in the household of Saul, right? And Saul was angry, and he was this demon was oppressing him or something, and so he takes his spear and he tries twice. He tries twice to pin David to the wall, and then later on we see that he tries it again. Here is David's spear right next to his head, and Abishai says, hey, you know that story? He took 3 times to try to kill you. He couldn't even do it. Give me once, I will kill him. One time, he's dead. He's pinned to the ground. Your problems are over. Abishai was correct in one thing. He was correct in that Saul had put David into, that God had put Saul into David's hand. He was correct in that. But he misunderstood the purpose. He was too quick to think that he understood what he was supposed to do with that. He acted hastily. He acted rather foolishly. And David corrects him. Go back 9 through 11. But David said to Abishai, do not destroy him. For who can put out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? And David said, as the Lord lives, the Lord will strike him, or his day will come to die, or he will go down into the battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I should put out my hand against the Lord's anointed. But take now the spear that is at his head and the jar of water, and let's go. And that's what they do. God had indeed orchestrated this event for David's good, right? So, but only so that not so that David could kill King Saul, but so that David could show himself faithful to God. That he still believed in God's promise, and that he would still deal equitably, and that he would still deal justly with God's anointed man. So here's David, just like in the cave, right? He has the opportunity. God has given Saul and put him in that cave where David is, and he goes into that cave and he tears and cuts that robe off, showing that the kingdom would ultimately be his. That he still believed the promise, that it was being ripped from Saul. It was ultimately going to be his. And now here he takes the spear, Saul's weapon, and his water jug, his source of sustenance, and he leaves with it. David always has the upper hand, but he is always being faithful to what God has called him to do, to be just, to be equitable. That is what God expects of a man, is it not? We see that in Micah. What does God love? What does God desire? What does God require? But for us to live justly, to love mercy, and walk humbly before our God. So there he is. He has to correct Abishai, and then he has to correct Abner in the army. If you look at verses 14 through 16, you'll see that David is correcting Abner. He's correcting the army, just like he corrected Abishai. We see there that Abner and the army had fallen asleep. Now you could say, well, but doesn't verse 12 say that God put a deep sleep on them? It's really not their fault necessarily, is it? But humanly speaking, they should have known that they were not to then leave their king so vulnerable, and that's what David's getting at. You have left your king vulnerable. And he starts talking to Abner. Before he does anything else, he gets up onto a hill far away, he shouts out, and he calls on Abner, and he asks Abner, "Are you a man?" And he's not concerned whether or not Abner he's not confused. Are you a man or are you a woman, right? But he is asking him, he's being a little derogatory, what kind of man are you? You're leaving your king vulnerable. A real man would protect his king. He would not fall asleep on him. And then he brings the army into it. We don't get this in the ESV so much, but in verse 16, if you look at verse 16, you'll see there, it says, "The thing that you have done is not good. As the Lord lives, you deserve to die." That you there, that's actually a plural you. I think the CSB gets that right. They bring that out, but we don't get that in the ESV. That's all the army. All your army, all 3,000 of you deserve to die because you have let your king down. You have left him vulnerable. But isn't it just Abishai and Abner and the army in which the foolishness is expressed, but it's also in King Saul. Saul wakes up, all that commotion. Can you imagine? It's probably not the best way to wake up. Definitely going to make you wake up on the wrong side of the bed to hear David's voice, once again taunting and saying that he had you in his grips and yet he was merciful. Saul wakes up, he recognizes David's voice, calls out to him. Make sure he's hearing right. Is that you, David, my son? Not a pleasant conversation ensues. Let's look at verses 18 through 20 here. David has confirmed that it is him, and he said, why does my Lord pursue after his servants? For what have I done? What evil is in my hands? Now therefore, if let my Lord the king hear the words of his servant. If it is the Lord who has stirred you up against me, may he accept an offering. But if it is men, may they be cursed before the Lord. For they have driven me out this day, that I should have no share in the heritage of the Lord, saying, go serve other gods. Now therefore, let not my blood fall to the earth away from the presence of the Lord. For the king of Israel has come out to seek a single flea, like one who hunts a partridge in the mountains. So we can look at this and we see that Saul's foolishness has been expressed basically in three ways. The first expression of foolishness was that Saul had no charge against David. He was angry with David, but for no reason. David had done absolutely nothing to him. You ever had a dream that somebody in that dream, a friend of yours or something like that, did something to you in the dream and you wake up and you're angry with that friend? Ever happened to you? It's happened to me. You can't really remember exactly why you're angry with them, but you're angry with them. This goes way beyond that, because generally we don't try to kill the friend that we had a dream about. Saul is angry with David, not because David did anything to him, but because he is jealous of him. And he was acting foolishly, and we know this from verse 21. Look at verse 21. Then Saul said, I have sinned. Return my son David, for I will no more do you harm, because my life was precious in your eyes this day. Behold, I have acted, what's that word? Foolishly. And have made a great mistake. And David was willing to make things right. If there was something that David had done, he was willing to do whatever it took. I will make a sacrifice to the Lord if the Lord has just turned you. I will do whatever it takes. But he had done nothing. Nothing that Saul could point to. Saul was just angry. He was jealous. Second foolish thing, foolish expression we see is that Saul allowed wicked men to counsel him. We saw this already in the caves. When David comes out of the cave, he already made the assessment. You are listening to foolish men. You are listening to these wicked men who are coming against me. These men were going against God's plan. They would have known by now that Samuel had said that God would rip the kingdom away from Saul and hand it over to somebody that was better. They would have known that. They are defying God's plan, encouraging Saul to do the same. They went so far as to tell David that he had no heritage, he had no portion, he had no place in God's kingdom. You need to go away and you need to find other gods to serve because God doesn't want you, Yahweh doesn't want you, we don't want you, leave. No portion. It's interesting to see, and we'll see Pastor Matt's going to be preaching next week, that it was really Saul who had no portion, and it was Saul who would wander away from God, who would die without him. The third expression of foolishness was the fact that Saul was out in the wilderness with 3,000 troops, seeking a man who had no intentions of harming him. Talk about overkill. 3,000 troops, really to find one man. A single flea, right? You go out, I don't remember, I was talking to somebody about catching birds. I have no idea. I think it was Jerry. I was talking to Jerry this week about catching birds. You go out to a field. There's some process to it, but you can go out to a field and you can catch a partridge, you can catch a dove, you can catch a bird, basically, right? You don't have to go into the mountains to catch a partridge, to catch a dove. You don't have to. Only a fool would go into the mountains because there is one partridge somewhere that he wants to find. It's got to be that one. That's what we would call foolishness, that's what we would call idiocy, right? That's what Saul is doing. There's David out there, he's got to kill him, but he doesn't have a reason for it. So he's being foolish. Meanwhile, he's leaving his own town, Gibeah, defenseless. He's taking the best of the best with him and leaving them defenseless. We saw this again when they were in the cave of Adullam. They were so close to getting to David, and then all of a sudden they realized, they get a report, the Philistines are attacking. He has to leave because he's got his troops with him. He's doing it again. What foolishness is this? That he is leaving his entire people defenseless because of one man who wasn't even trying to do anything to him. So David here he's speaking wisdom and truth to Abishai, and then to Abner in the army, and then to King Saul as well. And then we kind of see that there's this other foolish guy there in the story. We haven't gotten to him yet, but this is the king of Gath. Perhaps we could say that maybe Achish, the king of Gath, maybe he was more naive than he was foolish. But he allowed David, who had killed his greatest warrior, Goliath, into his city, ultimately to live for a while in Gath itself until David finally requests his own place, and then gives him an entire town called Ziklag, to which he took, and all of his men, 600 men, they go with their families into Ziklag. They basically take over the town. It's there for the kings always afterwards. King of Judah always owns Ziklag afterwards. And then falls for everything that David says. Whether that's naive or whether that's foolish, it's still in contrast to David and his cunning and his foresight ability. And beloved, we all act foolishly at some point in time. Again, I'm sure that we have our stories that we could tell. But here's the thing, when somebody steps in, when somebody like David, or last week we saw Abigail stepping in to correct our folly, we need to see it for what it is. This is God at work in our lives. Solomon wrote that the discerning sets his face, Proverbs 17:24, the discerning sets his face toward wisdom, but the eyes of the fools are on the ends of the earth. In other words, they look past the wisdom to what they want to do anyway. They look past the wisdom to their aspirations. Whatever it is, this is what I want. When God is sending wisdom, giving counsel right before them. At the same time, it may be that you're the one who has the wisdom that you can give to others. The question is, how do you do it? And when do you do it? When's the right time? Those are things probably that you need to pray about. Each circumstance is going to be different, but here's the thing. Speak truth in love. The writer not only shows God's working in foresight being established, not only in working in foolishness being expressed, but the writer of 1 Samuel shows God working in faithfulness being extolled. To extol something is to praise it, right? And so we see this both with David and Saul. They're both actually extolling David's faithfulness, and ultimately God's as well. The loyalty to God, basically, and also to Saul is being extolled here. So let's go verses 23 to 25 here in chapter 26, 23 to 25. The Lord rewards every man for his righteousness and his faithfulness. This is David speaking here. For the Lord gave you into my hand today, and I would not put out my hand against the Lord's anointed. Behold, as your life was precious this day in my sight, so may my life be precious in the sight of the Lord, and may he deliver me out of all tribulation. Then Saul said to David, Blessed be you, my son David. You will do many things and will succeed in them. And so David went his way, and Saul returned to his place. God rewards faithfulness. Faithfulness is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It's never a bad thing to be faithful to God. It's never a bad thing to show loyalty and express that loyalty to God. That's what David was doing. Yes, God handed Saul over into David's hand, but only to test, will he be faithful? Abishai wanted to throw faithfulness. He wanted to throw loyalty to the wind. Throw righteousness to the wind. Just do what needs to be done. Be pragmatic in this situation. Let me kill him. But David saw that it was good to be faithful. He extolled faithfulness. He saw them as ideals to be lived up to, even when it seems at the time that there are better options. He trusted God to bless him and to reward his commitment to his faithfulness and to his righteousness. And he didn't expect God to keep him from those tribulations, but ultimately to deliver him out of those tribulations through his faithfulness. Even Saul blessed David. If you look at verse 21, which I think we already took a look at, that you see there that Saul realizes David's goodness, David's loyalty, when he says that my life was precious to you. In contrast to that, of course, is Saul actually going around and trying to kill David. So David's life isn't precious to Saul, but even though David's life wasn't precious to Saul, Saul's life was still precious to David because he was God's anointed. It was more about who God is than it was about who Saul was. We tend to forget that. We tend to forget that we wrestle not against flesh and blood. Saul had betrayed David many times over, and David would not return the favor. Instead, he entrusted to God Saul. That God would take care of Saul in his own way. Maybe he'll die on his own. Maybe he'll die in battle. Something else. God will take care of it, just like he did Nabal. David didn't have to lift a finger against Nabal. God took care of it all. Brothers and sisters, here's the thing. We see in 1 Peter the same kind of idea. The same sentiment is in his first letter here. So let's go real quick to 1 Peter chapter 2. We're going to start at verse 21. Even though this context is in the idea of servants being faithful to masters and being Christ-like to their masters, it really can be applied to any one of us. It's still a good word for every single one of us. Verse 21, for to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. That's David. David had done nothing wrong. Saul was seeking him with 3,000 men. When he has the chance to return evil for evil, reviling for reviling, he refuses to do so. Why? Because he trusts God to take care of the problem. Stay faithful, brothers and sisters. Entrust your situation to God who judges justly. Let your faithfulness be extolled and blessed by Christ, even if you are suffering and to the point of death. Because there is nothing greater than to hear Christ say, "Come in, welcome, well done, my good and faithful servant." Sometimes we don't have to wait to that point. Sometimes God blesses us both in eternity and in the temporary. That's what he does with David. Sometimes he does it with us. He doesn't always do it. He doesn't always do it with David. And this time, he does. So we saw first that God worked through the foresight established, and then through foolishness expressed, and then faithfulness extolled, and now we come to the favorableness extended. Another way to say it is that God is gracious to us. It's important to remember, though, that at this point, because this is where it all gets to, right? This is where everything's climaxing to, is chapter 27 here, and because this isn't just simply for David. This is for all of Israel. His favorableness is not just simply for David. David is simply the instrument so that God can show grace to Israel. What we find is that David goes to Achish, the king of Gath, and after being there a while, like I said, he goes and he asks for a place to live, a town, so he gives him Ziklag. That Ziklag becomes property of the kings of Judah forever thereafter. And from Ziklag, David makes raids on various people groups. Look at chapter 27, verses 8 through 11. Now David and his men went up and made raids against the Geshurites and the Girzites and the Amalekites, for these were the inhabitants of the land from of old, as far as Shur to the land of Egypt. And David would strike the land and would leave neither man nor woman alive, but would take away the sheep, the oxen, the donkeys, the camels, and the garments, and come back to Achish. When Achish asked, "Where have you made a raid today?" David would say, "Against the Negeb of Judah," or "against the Negeb of the Jerahmeelites," easy for you to say, right? "And against the Negeb of the Kenites." And David would leave neither man nor woman alive to bring news to Gath, thinking lest they should tell about us and say, "So David has done." Such was his custom all the while he lived in the country of the Philistines, which we find earlier would be 16 months. Right? So you remember, go back, what Saul had said, "Blessed are you, David, my son David," right? You will do many things and will succeed in them. And God indeed was blessing him and being gracious. Favor was being extended to him. We see the Geshurites and the Girzites and the Amalekites. Those are only three of the names that are given. But the impression is by that last line that such was the custom of all he did while he was there. Seems to say that it wasn't just those three, but there were more. Go back, remember Joshua and his men. They didn't defeat everybody that they were supposed to, all the people groups that they were supposed to. Nobody was able to, but here is David, and he is hiding away in Gath, having the support of the king of his enemy, right? That's what it is, right? And he is going around and he is defeating the enemies of Israel. All the while, Saul is leaving him alone because he doesn't want to deal with Gath and the Philistines anymore. And ultimately, he is defeating the enemies of Israel so that ultimately when he becomes king, they won't need to be defeated. He's already started the process. He's doing what nobody was able to do before. Talk about success. Talk about God's favor upon his life. That's exactly what's going on. Here's the thing. Oftentimes, we will downplay what God is doing for us or for his kingdom when we are in the wilderness, when things seem bleak. God's not doing anything. I don't see him working. Israel didn't see it. King of Gath thought that he was actually becoming a stench to Israel. He thought he was defeating Israel. In fact, he was making Israel even that much stronger. So may we never downplay what God is doing for us or for his kingdom just because things seem bleak or disastrous. May we never doubt God's working just because we don't see it, see what he's doing. May we never think that God cannot use us as his glorious instruments just because we are in that wilderness. As we conclude, I go back to John Piper's quote. God is always doing 10,000 things in your life, and you may be aware of 3 of them. In this case, we saw 4. God is working through establishing foresight, expressing foolishness, extolling faithfulness, and extending favor. But there are 1,000 other ways, if we are willing to look, that we can see him working in our lives. If you are not yet a Christian, I ask you strongly to consider giving your whole being to Christ. Count the cost. But I would say it's worth it. Because there is going to be a day when Christ returns. He came the first time to bring salvation. He's coming the second time to bring judgment. For everybody that would not trust in him, would it be that you would have the foresight to receive Christ, to turn away from your own sin, and to trust him, to give you a right standing with the Father, and to work into your life holiness and goodness? David did not sit down and just simply throw up his hands and do nothing. Just because he was in the wilderness, just because he was on the run. He didn't just give up. He took the very gifts, we talked about that already, that God has given him, the cunning, he gave him he took those gifts that God had given to him and he used them for the betterment of his people and for the glory of God. Beloved, are we not to do the same thing? We who are in Christ have been given spiritual gifts. We have been given gifts from the Holy Spirit to use for the betterment of each other, to encourage each other, to love and good works. Can we not do these from our home, do these in our neighborhoods, do these in our church buildings? Let us continue to be faithful to our calling and to be faithful to the gifts that God has given to us. Let us continue to use those gifts for the betterment of the church and for the betterment of the kingdom and to the glory of God.